What is it like to come face to face with evil? To confront your worst nightmare? When a killer comes calling, there's often no escape.
A man who can kill is evil beyond belief.
To truly encounter evil is a rarity most will never experience.
I believe in evil, and I have experienced people that are evil.
But for those unfortunate few who do and survive to tell the tale, the mental scars often never heal.
I couldn't breathe, my eyes felt bulging, all I could see was his face on my face, and he was just staring into my eyes.
We meet the men and women whose lives have been forever altered by their brush with the beasts who live among us. This is Encounters with Evil. In tonight's program, the murderers who kill for thrills, looking to break the last taboo and take a human life for the sheer excitement of that murderous moment.
The offender is killing for the sheer pleasure. They're killing for kicks, they're killing because they're enjoying it.
The thriller wants to have the notoriety, he wants to have the pleasure and the fame.
By killing more than one, or by killing them in a different way, a strange way, then they make sure that they will be talked about.
Coming up, the backpacker killer, Australian serial murderer Ivan Millat.
These people were done used to these girls, that they are just proper animals and they ought to be shot.
Colin, the gay slayer who chose to become a serial killer as a New Year's resolution.
Tonight, Colin starts a very long period in prison, knowing that the judge has recommended he never be released.
But first, the depraved life of Denis Nilsen, the killer who lived with corpses for company and butchered 15 innocent men to get rid of their bodies.
There is no doubt that there was a thrill element in what he did.
What makes a person become a multiple murderer or serial killer is a question forensic psychologists and criminologists wrestle with their entire professional lives. There are some developmental red flags that, if caught early enough, can point towards such gruesome behavior in later life.
But when we look at multiple killers and serial murderers, we find that there can be a number of motivations behind their evil acts. These can range from motives such as sexual, sadistic desires, through a desire to be in control or to contain people, or there could be a whole range of other reasons, sometimes related to childhood, sometimes related to other inadequacies in their adulthood.
But then there are the killers who confound all theories, whose upbringings appear on the surface to have been relatively stable. Denis Nilsen is one of those. A mild-mannered civil servant by day, by night a perverted necrophiliac who would chop up the bodies of his victims and flush them down the toilet. In a hidden reign of terror, Nielsen slaughtered up to 15 young men.
Nielsen was born far north of Scotland, Fraserburgh, in November 1945, the son of a troubled marriage. He had a Scots mother and a Norwegian father, who they certainly did not get on.
He spent the early years of his life in this house. According to his mother, he was a quiet boy. Little, if anything, marked him out from the ordinary.
But he had no tactile relationship with his mother, for a start. His mother told me that she was never able to cuddle him. That made him isolated.
How do you think Denis was able to become involved in this kind of problem and then be able to live from day to day?
No, that's the bit I don't understand. I just don't understand how this could go on and nobody knowing anything. I mean, I don't know any but these 10 years of his life.
When Nielsen was 4, his father left unceremoniously, but he developed a close relationship with his grandfather, whom he idolised between the ages of 4 and 6.
When Nielsen was 6, his beloved grandfather, a trawlerman, died at sea of a heart attack. Denis learns of his grandfather's death in the most brutal fashion. The news is not broken to the young boy gently.
His mother took him to see his grandfather's body, but Nielsen didn't know his grandfather had died. And so this small boy is ushered into, in a very Scots tradition, to see the body, which has a tremendous impact on him.
Nobody had prepared him for the fact that this was going to be a dead grandfather. So his understanding of love, which had been concentrated on that man, and his understanding of death, which was now concentrated on that body, fused.
Somehow in Nielsen's thinking, he somehow associates his grandfather with death, and death being a lovely state to be in.
It was the experience of seeing his grandfather in his coffin at the age of 6 that he subsequently suggested incited in him the idea of necrophilia, that gave him a fascination with dead bodies, a fascination which he was to live out.
30 years later, and Nielsen's psychological issues manifest themselves in the most hideous way imaginable.
It was about 8 o'clock, and the police came to the front door and said, could they go in my garden? So I said, yes, there's no reason why they shouldn't. Then they said, there's something unpleasant going on next door.
Unpleasant is an understatement for the horrific murders that had been taking place in the neighbouring house.
In his own rather fastidious way, he decided that he would skin them, chop the heads off, boil bits of the body so that the skin would come away from the skeleton, and flush some bits of it down the loo, including some of the smaller bones, and hang on to the heads.
It was this fastidiousness and attention to detail that was to prove Nielsen's downfall.
I was called to 23 Cranley Gardens because it was a blocked drain. Lifting the manhole cover was... the smell was unbelievable. I was down there at least 5 or 6 times, and by that time I'd recognised, various body parts that were most definitely human.
Nielsen is arrested by police on his return from work. He displays no emotion.
Are you Denis Nilsen?
Yes.
I'm Detective Chief Inspector J from Hornsey Police Station. I've come about your drains.
He seems almost relieved the police have turned up.
The man currently being questioned by police is a 37-year-old civil servant, Andrew Nielsen, known to his colleagues at work as Des. For the past 6 months, he's been working here at the Manpower Services Commission in London's Kentish town.
Inside Nielsen's top-floor flat in Cranley Gardens, North London police discover a crime scene so grim, it seemed almost unbelievable.
As soon as he opened the door to his apartment, the smell of death came out of the doors.
He knew what was in there, and he knew that we were going to find what was in there.
With deadly calm, Nielsen told the police that the remains of the bodies of several men were in 2 plastic bags in the front room.
I put my head inside the front room, and there was this distinct smell of decomposing flesh.
Taken to the police station, Nielsen begins a grueling 31 hours of police interview. What drove him to kill? The police were about to find out in quite explicit detail.
He was looking for a meaningful relationship. He had quite a few sexual experiences with different men, but what he wanted was a long-term relationship. And then we come to the first murder. That wasn't planned in a sense. He picked up a 14-year-old boy trying to buy a drink in a pub at 14. And Nielsen bought the drinks for him, and they said, why don't you come round to my place? They had a few more drinks, and then strangling him with a necktie. He masturbated over the boy several times. He washed him, he cared for him, and then he put him under the floorboards.
After Nielsen had unburdened himself, the police carried out further investigations into other locations he'd previously lived.
The search then moved here to another house a few miles away in Cricklewood. From what they'd learned, the police started looking for up to 13 more bodies. It's believed they could be tramps and vagrants from a nearby hostel.
Here it wasn't the drains that contained human remains.
We have found considerable items of bone this morning and this afternoon, and we will continue with the search tomorrow. I'm not scientifically minded, but I would think that probably one piece is from a hip and a small part of a rib.
Pathologists found the identifiable remains of some 6 bodies. The true extent of Nielsen's depravity was becoming sickeningly evident. After his first murder, Nielsen was locked into a loop of repeating behavior for the next 5 years, a psychosis of killing, fueled by alcohol. More and more bodies would end up underneath his floorboards.
He felt safe when the person he was admiring could not resist it, his admiration, could not answer back, could not say don't, could not object. An inability to make contact with human beings, except by killing them and turning them into things, and things are much more easy.
Keeping the corpses for company was what he wanted. The killing was almost a necessary evil.
Having these pretend companions in the house when he got home was to him a kind of, as close as he could get to being like other people. And he would keep them like that until rigor mortis set in and they became a bit unbearable.
Nielsen was clearly a man who enjoyed orgasms. Those orgasms were part of the complete thrill he got in the act of murder. There was clearly intense sexual contact before the strangulation, before the drowning, and then afterwards with the bodies. There certainly can be no denying the thrill he took in it.
Eventually, he'd have to dispose of the corpses.
And they'd stay under the floorboards for months until there was no more room. And then he made a bonfire in the back garden and put the human remains on that. And the neighborhood children, not realizing what they were watching, used to dance around the bonfire.
Denis Nilsen's trial in October 1983 was front-page news, a sensation across the nation. At the time, he was the worst serial killer the country had ever known. But his heinous acts seemed to surprise his mother.
He's always my son. And that's why I want him to know that we're all concerned about him. And I just hope he'll get some help to cope with the situation he's in.
It was precisely 10 o'clock when Denis Andrew Nilsen was led into the dock to face the bench of 3 magistrates. The charge, a single charge of murdering Stephen Neil Sinclair, was read over to him. There were objections to bail and no application was made.
Carl Stotter revealed his own brush with death in Nielsen's flat.
I fell asleep and I woke up and he was strangling me. And I passed out after sort of thinking. I thought that I'd got caught up in the sleeping bag, which he'd warned me about, and I thought he was helping me out, but he wasn't. And anyway, I passed out from that, and I remember vaguely hearing water running and being carried, and I felt very cold, and I realised I was in the bath and he was trying to drown me.
I think Carl Stotter escaped with his life for the simplest reason of all, an accident. I think Nielsen didn't pull off the strangulation part, realised that he hadn't managed it, and then had an attack of remorse. I think Nielsen was capable of remorse, and Carl Stotter is proof of it.
Years later, Carl Stotter had a different view of the reasons he encountered evil and lived to tell the tale.
The reason why Nielsen spared me was because there was no more room under the floorboards for another body.
While Nielsen's guilt was obvious, his defense counsel argued he was mentally diminished and the charges should be reduced to manslaughter.
He may not be insane, but he is not correct. He's not a human being in the fullest sense. There was something crucial which is missing.
The jury returned a guilty of murder verdict by a majority of 10-2, and on the 3rd of December 1983, Denis Nilsen was sentenced to life imprisonment.
Summing up at the trial of Denis Nilsen, Judge Croom Johnson told the court, there are evil people who do evil things. Committing murder is one of them. I think he was rather understating the case. Nielsen killed 15 young men that we know of. There is no doubt in my mind that that is evil at its most incarnate.
Now for Ivan Millat, the backpacker murderer, the Australian serial killer who brutally took 7 young lives.
Millat is undoubtedly one of the most dangerous human beings to have walked this earth. He's an individual who kills without conscience, enjoys the thrill, and also was willing to kill large numbers of people without question. He's an individual that should never be let out of prison.
Millat is one of Australia's most notorious serial killers. From 1989 to 2006, he journeyed across Australia, following tourist trails on an expedition of murder, targeting young backpackers as his victims.
He's incredibly dangerous. What's also shocking in his case is the amount of torture and depravity he inflicted upon his victims, often in pairs, with often victims witnessing unspeakable tortures happening to their partners and friends very nearby. So not only was he a prolific serial murderer, but also a torturer as well.
All 7 bodies of the young backpackers were found in shallow graves or hidden under rocks in the Belanglo State Forest south of the city.
2 of the victims were Australian, while the 5 others were foreign backpackers, 3 Germans and 2 British girls who were the first to be found.
Today, police revealed that 4 people have come forward in the past 24 hours who claim to have seen the girls in a country town close to the murder site. But detectives also concede that finding whoever's responsible for this hideous crime so long after it happened will not be easy.
Superintendent Clive Small would be the man tasked with the seemingly impossible job of hunting down Australia's most depraved serial murderer.
When I was given the job, my initial reaction was probably, there's a good chance this won't be solved. And the reasoning behind that was, you know, the fact they were backpackers, the isolation, the time lapse, the degradation of evidence at the crime scene.
Millat's burial site in Belanglo State Forest was discovered by 2 runners who came across a decomposing corpse.
I got a call at work and it was asked by the then region commander to go down and assess the situation where these skeletons had been recovered down in Belanglo State Forest.
A day later, 2 police constables unearthed a second body a few meters from the first.
I think what the crime scenes told me and what the advice of psychiatrists and other people we spoke to told me was that this was a killer who was particularly vicious, who was particularly cold and who was particularly calculating. We had a serial killer who we believed would continue to kill until he was caught.
After the first body was discovered in the forest and the police were alerted, it became apparent quite quickly that there was a second body. And there were a number of missing tourists and backpackers who could possibly be the bodies that had been found in the forest.
Initial news reports suggested they were the bodies of two missing British backpackers, Caroline Clark and Joanne Walters, who'd disappeared from a Sydney suburb 5 months earlier.
The two missing Britons vanished from their rented room at Easter and stopped phoning home regularly. Their Australian bank accounts have not been touched since April, and Sydney police have now called in murder squad detectives to investigate their disappearance.
Police quickly confirmed that the bodies were indeed those of Clark and Walters.
5 months after the two young Britons disappeared in Sydney during a working holiday of Australia, forensic experts confirmed that one of the bodies found over the weekend is that of Joanne Walters. But they'll not be certain that the second is her friend Caroline Clark until dental records arrive from London tomorrow. The appalling fate they met, however, is beyond doubt.
The apparent cause of death of Joanne Walters was penetrating wounds to the chest, consistent with them being stab wounds.
The way that Millat killed his victims was incredibly violently. You're talking about 10 gunshots to the head, 35 stab wounds to other people. So different ways of killing, but always with an intent, which is to totally destroy the area of the body that he wishes to destroy. In the case of blowing somebody's head to pieces, for example. So potentially he was aware that people wouldn't be able to trace who those human beings were. So there was a calculation, but there was also a highly aggressive violence.
There was a cloth around Joanne's mouth and neck area, which suggested she may have been gagged. The second victim, also a young woman, suffered an equally horrifying end.
The preliminary investigation of the other female body suggests that the cause of death there may well be gunshot wounds to the head.
The violent nature of their deaths revealed there was an extremely dangerous killer on the loose.
There were several things that were particularly chilling about the murders. It's quite clear that in a number of cases, at least, if not all the cases, the victims did not die immediately, but were alive for a period of time.
What the police would have been looking at was a highly dangerous individual who had the power, the ability to abduct and control not just one, but two individuals.
For the parents of Caroline Clark and Joanne Walters, the news of their daughter's encounter with evil was utterly devastating.
These are evil-minded people. And like dogs with rabies, there's only one way they're going to be put down and destroyed, because the world hasn't got the resources to keep putting these people in jail. There's got to be some system whereby we destroy these people, put their evil genes anywhere else.
Struggling to maintain her composure, Mrs. Walters fought back the tears as she condemned her daughter's killer.
That's all I want to say is that these people who have done these to these girls, that they are just proper animals and they ought to be shot.
Despite a fingertip search of the surrounding forest over the next 5 days, no further evidence was uncovered. Investigators had little hope of an early resolution to this horrendous crime. Just over a year later, a local man discovered a human skull and thigh bone in an isolated section of the forest.
The only real help the police had in this investigation were the deposition sites and the bodies themselves. That the bodies had not been concealed particularly well was quite telling. The level of post-mortem injury was very important to them, and also that on some occasions the victims had been decapitated and their skulls had been separated from the bodies was very useful to the police.
This is someone that really no one would like to meet on a dark night in Australia.
Police soon identified the corpses as those of Australians Deborah Everest and her boyfriend, James Gibson.
The discovery of the last 3 bodies provided some more clues to try and link all of the victims together.
The manner of these deaths was perverted beyond belief.
Given that the male victim of the 3 was found with several bullet wounds to the head, and the victims had been stabbed in excess of 40 times, suggests either one offender is engaging in a lot of post-mortem overkill, or perhaps there were multiple offenders and everyone was having a go.
There were also signature aspects to all the murders. Each of the bodies had been deliberately posed face down with their hands behind their backs, covered by a pyramid frame of sticks and ferns.
One of the things that's quite significant about Millat is the way that he disposed of his victims. So he would bury them, but the way that he would do it would involve things like hog tying the victims and also covering them in quite a ritualistic way, like in ferns, for example. Now, this suggests that it wasn't just the capture and killing of his victims that was important. It was actually the whole process.
It may be that Millat actually was thinking in terms of misdirection in making these little constructions around a body. Perhaps he just wanted to entirely mislead the investigation process.
From the available evidence, investigators started to develop a profile of the backpacker murderer. They were helped by a public appalled by the depraved details that were emerging.
Police forces in murder investigations are able to utilize a number of tools in their toolbox to try and identify unknown subjects. CCTV footage is one, forensic evidence is another, and fingerprints and genetics can all be used. They also have other semi-scientific, less well-proved techniques that they can use. One of which is what we commonly refer to as criminal profiling, which is at best a semi-scientific or pseudo-scientific way of taking all of the evidence at crime scenes, abduction scenes and deposition sites to try and produce a psychological portrait of the killer.
The team scoured their own internal police archive and computer files for vehicle records, gym memberships and gun licensing. The profile of the victims made the hunt even more complicated.
What confounded a lot of the police inquiries was the nature of the victims. They were people who were holidaying, they were backpacking, they were people who were not in their normal environs, they were not using their credit cards. Therefore, they were less traceable than they would have been if they'd been on home turf.
Millat was, in fact, already in the police system. He'd been imprisoned for the double rape of 2 girls 20 years previously. But identifying him as the backpacker killer was a different matter.
The police in the Millat case, their unknown subject, was on file. They just didn't know which name of all the thousands of names they had on file it was. So they had to cross-reference and triangulate a lot of little bits of evidence to try and point to the right person.
By a painstaking process of elimination, the vast list of potential killers was eventually whittled down to just 32 suspects. The name of the killer was on that list, and his name was Ivan Millat. The publicity surrounding the case, already labelled the backpacker murders, led to a break. A British witness, Paul Onions, who'd narrowly escaped Millat's clutches 4 years earlier, came forward.
Some of the strongest evidence in the trial is going to come from the so far unnamed English hitchhiker who survived an attempt to rob and kill him 4 years ago.
Onions flew to Australia to help with the investigation.
Paul Onions' impact was vital in that ultimately he was able to travel to Australia and help provide a physical recognition, identify Millat in a lineup that Millat was the man who tried to rob and abduct him and kill him.
Acquaintances also told police about Millat's obsession with weapons.
Ivan Millat was undoubtedly a psychopath, and he was very proficient. He had a macabre interest in weapons, and it's essentially like having that God complex, a recognition that you are so powerful, so important, that you will decide when and if somebody dies.
Police now embark on a major operation. 300 officers search houses belonging to Millat's brothers. Simultaneously, 50 heavily armed officers raid Millat's house and surround the premises.
When we decided to go in, there was a very high sense of tension. We knew that Ivan was certainly dangerous, and there were reasons to believe that other members of the family were also dangerous.
The police were successful in finally apprehending their man.
Down on your face, quick!
The distraught families of the victims travelled from Germany and Britain for the trial.
In the charge sheet presented to the court today, the police say their tests have positively identified a rifle found at Millat's house with the weapon used to kill the Britons Joanne Walters and Caroline Clark.
The evidence police found at Millat's house was overwhelmingly strong. They'd found a .22 caliber rifle, they'd found camping equipment. It was immediately very clear to the police that he was clearly involved in the abductions and the killings and robberies of the victims from the souvenirs and possessions he'd kept.
Ivan Millat, the 49-year-old former truck driver, was arrested 9 days ago. Charged at first with armed robbery, he's now been accused of Australia's worst serial killings.
At the killer's house were items he'd kept as trophies from his vicious death spree. Most grisly of all, a headband identical to one found on the decapitated head of German victim Simone Schmidl.
Millat definitely enjoyed having mementos of his victims. It's the ultimate power because you own something that nobody else has. That is the knowledge that you took that life. That is the knowledge that you are potentially the only person in the world who knows how they met their end and where they are now.
Millat's trial, which opened in March 1996, was to last a grueling 15 weeks.
The man whose gruesome killings shocked Australia was starting a life sentence today. Until the end, Ivan Millat, known for his passion for guns, had protested his innocence. But the jury, reduced to 11 after a death threat against one, did not believe him. He was found guilty of all 7 murders in the Belanglo forest near Sydney.
The trauma of the trial was now over for the families of the victims, though their own brush with evil would haunt them forever.
What I would ask for now, for my wife and all our family, is a little privacy.
Are you almost relieved now that the weight of all those kind of months of anxiousness are over?
Yes, it is a relief, in a funny sort of way.
Ivan Millat was convicted of the murders and is serving 7 consecutive life sentences, as well as 18 years without parole.
Sentencing Millat to 7 life terms, the judge said he'd shown a callous indifference to suffering and a complete disregard of humanity, which was almost beyond belief.
The most important part here is that we had a person in Ivan Millat who was a serial killer who would have gone on killing until he was caught or died. He's been caught, he'll spend the rest of his life in jail, he'll never see daylight again, and that's where he should be.
Millat's killing career and warped world finally brought to a close. Our final story, like our first, involves a killer who made a conscious decision to embark on a spree of murders for the thrill of the kill.
A thrill killer is a term that we use to try and make sense of those murders that don't seem to make sense. The offender is killing for the sheer pleasure. They're killing for kicks, they're killing because they're enjoying it and they're getting better at it.
Colin Ireland was one such thrill killer. He also craved the twisted satisfaction of getting one over on the police.
I think he was more absolutely arrogant and absolutely believing that he could outsmart everybody, not just the police.
Many violent criminals hide behind a warped worldview based on prejudice and ignorance.
You see serial killers selecting their victims from those groups in society that are marginalised. Gay men, runaways, strays, drug users, homeless individuals, old people, children from disrupted families. So there are clearly easy, soft targets for serial killers to access. In Ireland's case, he claims that gay men were the easiest group for him to get access to.
Some said Ireland's motives were homophobic.
He sat on our settee and said, "I really hate homosexuals."
Police and psychologists disagreed that this was the case, with the man dubbed the Gay Slayer.
I don't think it was a hate crime. He never expressed any great hate against homosexuals. I think it was simply homosexuals an easy target.
We talk about the gay community. It could have been any other section of the community. I wanted to burn down the world. His hatred was of people.
What is true is that the victims of his murderous campaign were all gay. During his gruesome killing spree in 1993, Ireland tortured and strangled 5 young men.
Colin Ireland arrived at court already charged with 1 murder and now facing another. The 39-year-old unemployed man was arrested by detectives investigating the killings of 5 homosexuals.
Colin Ireland's interesting. One day I was working in the hospital and I got a phone call from a well-known newspaper asking me to give them some advice on a rather bizarre case.
The court also heard that Ireland telephoned the police and the newspaper, saying it was his New Year resolution to kill another human being.
My understanding of what he said to the papers was that he had made a New Year's resolution that he was going to be a serial killer and he was going to kill at least 5 people. And the reason for killing 5 people would then put him into the Premier League of serial killers. The first thing I did say to him was to treat it as a serious threat. This guy wasn't a joker, he was a player, he knew what he wanted to do.
The first victim of this twisted and deadly resolution was 45-year-old choreographer Peter Walker, a regular at the Colin pub.
Ireland met all his victims in or near a pub in West London, which is a popular meeting place with the gay community.
Back at Walker's home, Ireland suggests some bondage games, and Walker willingly agrees to be tied up. Ireland then beats the helpless man senseless and suffocates him. But what was his real motive? Surely it was not just a casual decision.
Ireland decided that his life was going nowhere, that he'd had a number of failed relationships, he'd been jailed on several occasions for burglary and theft and petty offences. His life was going nowhere, and he decided he wanted to be a serial murderer.
Ireland went after men who were into sadomasochistic sex on the grounds it would be easy to tie them up before he slaughtered them.
His MO was that he would attend gay pubs at the Colin pub mainly, and he would find someone that he could convince that he was of a similar persuasion around that particular sexual activity.
Ireland paid chilling attention to detail when carrying out his murderous plans.
Mr. Nutting said the murders had been premeditated and meticulously planned. Ireland had been extremely thorough, taking a different pair of gloves to each murder to avoid leaving fingerprints. He'd forced his victims to reveal the PIN numbers of their cash cards, to reimburse himself for the cost of the last murder, and to re-equip himself for the next.
I don't know if he studied other serial killers, but he did plan his murders, and he certainly had an escape clause in his murders. He certainly carried a change of clothes, and he had something to, commit the murder with. He did have we would say, going equipped in the police service. That's what we would say.
One of the things he did was he went back to some guy's house, killed him, and then stayed there with the body for about 4 hours so that he could go out in the early morning commuter rush. So nobody would notice a man walking out of a block of flats 7 o'clock in the morning. They would notice at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Exasperated by the police's inability to connect the dots and solve the crimes, Ireland calls detectives to taunt them.
Colin Ireland had phoned up the newspaper and said that he had actually killed 1 victim, and could the police go around and deal with the dog? And then they found the victim tied up like a Christmas turkey.
A few months later, back at the Colin, Ireland picks up 37-year-old Christopher Dunn. They go back to Dunn's house, and on the 30th of May, he's discovered bound, gagged, and strangled. Feelings in the gay community were running high.
I think they're going to be, in a word, terrified. I think they're going to be frightened of rumour and counter-rumour, and they're going to be very worried that the next person they meet in a club or a pub could be the murderer.
Police did not initially link the first 2 killings.
They were in two different districts, they were in different boroughs, and I know the second murder was regarded as death by misadventure. So I don't believe the police put two and two together and made four.
The feelings of the gay communities in Soho clearly were that someone was targeting them, but they also felt that they weren't being protected by the police who should be there to help them. The police admitted at the time that their investigation was flawed and that they should have done more to protect the gay community.
Certainly the gay community in Brixton, there was one of fear, there was one of mistrust, there was one of, I would suppose they were concerned whether the police were actually trying.
Despite heightened vigilance in the gay community, Ireland goes on to kill his third victim, an American businessman, Perry Bradley III. Again, he calls the media to taunt them, but it's the timing of his fourth murder that is the most audacious.
Yeah, on the same day of a press release, you know, trying to gain the confidence of the community that he commits another murder is a slap in the face for the police, and it's, you know, if he knew that, it's a horrendously brazen act.
Here we can see a really clear case of the killer manipulating the media in how they report about their actions, and that shows how narcissistic Ireland was. The deaths weren't important to him, but the headlines were.
This killing follows the same pattern, with the victim bound and brutalized, death by strangulation.
After each murder, he burned clothing and footwear and anything else which could be traced back to him, including the cord he used to tie his victims.
It was the brutal slaying of Ireland's fourth victim that was to give police their first breakthrough. Ireland got careless. After being tied up and tortured, 37-year-old Andrew Collier was slain in his own home, having first watched Ireland kill his cat.
So what he did with the fourth victim was that he strangled the guy's cat in front of him and then put the cat's mouth round his John Thomas, so they would know actually he wasn't an animal lover.
The usually meticulous murderer, normally so painstaking in cleaning up, leaves a fingerprint at the scene of the crime. It was to be his eventual undoing.
The fifth murder for Ireland, as he saw it, was a completion of his work. He'd now killed 5 victims, which meant to him he was a successful, notorious serial killer.
It was the murder of 41-year-old chef Emanuele Spiteri that raised the body count to 5.
He had to get 5, that was the magic number for him to start with. But what was interesting was he was actually caught on camera with the victim.
It's the breakthrough the police need. CCTV cameras capture Spiteri's last known movements, boarding a train at Charing Cross Station, accompanied by an unknown, heavily built man.
Police were able to trace back via CCTV and find footage of Spiteri on a train on his way home, accompanied by Ireland. This CCTV footage was released by the police, and it clearly spooked Ireland into taking action.
Aware that his image is now all over the TV and papers, Ireland makes a bizarre decision.
So he went with his solicitor to the police station and said, yes, I was with him, we engaged in various activities, but I didn't kill him. Unfortunately for him, unfortunately for the rest of the world, the police didn't believe him.
He contacted the police and said that yes, he was with Spiteri and he went home with Spiteri, but there were 3 men there. And Ireland had left, leaving Spiteri alone with this mystical third person who must have killed him. That, unfortunately for him, didn't work because his fingerprints were found at another victim's house from earlier on in his spree, and the police were able to link Ireland to all of those murders.
In custody, Ireland confesses to all 5 murders, but offers few clues as to why he committed such repulsive crimes.
Ireland essentially said that he wasn't homophobic, but that he was essentially a misanthrope. He disliked all of humanity. He felt he was dealt a bad hand and he wanted to take revenge on society.
Being bullied, it's a fairly massive leap, isn't it? To murdering 5 people after you've convinced them that you're going around to have a pleasurable moment. It's quite a leap, isn't it, to say, well, I was bullied as a child.
With a confession in the bag, there's no need for a trial, and Ireland is sentenced at the Old Bailey to 5 consecutive life terms. The judge, Justice Sachs, makes it clear that life will mean life, and he should never be released.
Ireland's defence gave no excuses for his behaviour, saying he was neither insane nor suffering from diminished responsibility, but he'd reached a point where he wanted to be caught.
When the judge was summing up at the end of the trial, he said to take 1 life is an outrage, to take 5 is carnage. And that, I think, is quite a good way to sum up what Colin Ireland did. But he won't be doing it anymore because he died in prison.
Mourned by few, Ireland died in February 2012, aged 57, in Wakefield Prison.